So Esther chapters 5 and 6. Let's see, show of hands. Were you here last week, Wednesday night? Show of hands, you were here last week. Really good, way to go. All right, cool. So we finished off last week in chapter 4, and we're starting to move into 5 and 6 here this week in the book of Esther. I looked around, I saw some of your hands. It looked about, more than half of folks have been here, maybe throughout the entire time going through the book of Esther. But we really start to wrestle with this week in chapter 5. The story kind of hits a peak point of conflict, a peak point of challenge in the life of Esther. And one of the things that makes me think about personally, as I think about my life and things that I've experienced, I remember specifically November 2008. In November 2008, I was a couple years out of undergrad from APU, and had been married the year before that, and was helping out a little bit at my church and doing a few different things. And I was going to seminary at the time. And there was a specific weekend where my dad, who's a pastor, was getting ready to preach services on Sunday, but my mom gave me a call on Saturday, and it's kind of an interesting call. It was like 9 p.m. on a Saturday night. She says, hey, your dad is scheduled to preach tomorrow at all 3 of the services, but I think he has the flu. So immediately I'm thinking, okay, well, why are you calling me at 9 p.m. on Saturday night before a Sunday? She says, well, we might need you to preach tomorrow. And I'm like, all right. Thank God we're Pentecostal, man. Like, the Spirit's going to lead into something. So I go and, I go, first I go visit my dad. I want to, hey, Pop, how you doing? How you feeling? I'm all right. I'm just going to rest, and maybe when I wake up in the morning, I'll be good to go. And that's my dad. He never admits any kind of weakness. I don't know, anybody have any dads like that? Like they just act all tough all the time? That's my dad for sure. Plus he's Mexican, so you throw that in there, But so I go, Dad, how you doing? I'm okay. And then so finally I said, Dad, you just need to rest. So he goes, okay, all my notes are on my desk in my office. So I went at 9 o'clock at night to my dad's office, and I spent almost all night, got a little bit of sleep, just studying his notes for the next day. And so that's the first time I ever done something like that. So sure enough, Monday rolls around, so we go through Sunday, Monday rolls around, and my dad, again, back to the whole I'm a tough guy thing. It's like he waits till the last possible moment to go to the hospital, and the whole while we're thinking that it's like a flu or something like that. So I have a test on Monday in Pasadena at Fuller. So I'm driving up to my test. I go check in with my dad. We get a text message and it says, oh, we're going to take Dad in to get checked out because I don't know, it seems like it's getting worse. And but maybe he'll go in there. They'll give him fluids and everything will be cool. All of a sudden, I get out of my test and I look at my phone and I realize there had been 25 text messages. That ever happened to you? You haven't looked at your phone and then all of a sudden it's a group text and then people are sending too many emojis and stuff like that. And then it's what? I get 25 text messages. And they're all from my family. They're all about my dad. And I just read the last text first, going backward, and the last text says, your dad's going into surgery. I thought to myself, I just said bye to him because he had the flu. I didn't think that, and then they said, and by the way, there's a 1% chance that he's going to make it through the surgery. He had gotten an infection, an intestinal infection, and they were going to have to go in and do all kinds of stuff. And they just said, because of the condition that he's in and how long he had, stayed away, it just kept getting worse and worse. And by the time they caught it, they said, it doesn't look like we caught it in time. And, oh, man, I don't know if you ever got news like that. I don't know if you ever got a call like that or a text I don't know if you ever got an experience like that where all of a sudden it just felt like your world just changed. And that was kind of what that felt like. And I remember going to the hospital and we were all in the waiting room and we were all just praying. And the people from the church, because we got a pretty big church down in LA, were coming, and the whole waiting room was filled. There wasn't even walking room in the waiting room because people were just flooding and coming, and we were just praying. We were singing songs. We were praying. We couldn't go in because, they wouldn't let anybody in. And we were in tears and just really feeling like really feeling hopeless, really feeling helpless, not really knowing necessarily what was going to happen. Long story short, after about almost, it felt like an entire day, the surgeons came out and they said, he made it through surgery, but we're not too sure if he's ever going to recover to his normal self, that kind of thing. Ended up being in a coma, medically induced coma, for another month and a half. And today, if you saw my dad, if you had a conversation with him, you'd never know this happened back in 2008. But this was a life-altering experience for me that caused me to really think about life, to think about faith, to think about all these different things, to think about prayer, to think about what do I do when I'm faced with situations that are bigger than me? What do I do when I'm faced with challenges that I honestly don't have control over? And here we find ourselves in the story of Esther, chapter 5. And if you've been following the story of Esther, you'll see that this is a story of ups and downs. And it's kind of like life, we have positive, amazing mountaintop experiences, but we have valley experiences when we go through these different things. And that's like Esther's life. She was orphaned. The story tells us that she didn't have a mother or a father. It doesn't even tell us what happened to her parents. It just says that she doesn't have them. So her uncle, Mordecai, raises her, and she's in this foreign land. But then because of her attributes and different things, she's elevated to a position of power. And then while she's in a position of power, in chapter 4, she gets news that Haman, this kind of evil guy, comes up with this plan to destroy all Jews. And she doesn't know about it, but Mordecai finds out, and Mordecai sends a message to her that simply says, Esther, you're our only hope. They want to annihilate the Jews, and you are a Jew, and you are in the royal household, the royal palace. We need you to do something. And that's where Pastor Woody last week talked about these really famous responses that we know well when she says, Mordecai says, maybe you were there for such a time as this. Maybe you're there on purpose. Maybe you are in this position in the midst of this challenge on purpose. And I want to think about that as you experience our challenges. Oftentimes we are like challenge averse. We don't want anything to do with obstacles, but every once in a while we have to be reminded that it's often through those challenges and trials that God shapes us into who He wants us to be. Comfort very rarely takes us to new levels, but discomfort will. And so Esther's in this place. She's like a queen now. She's got everything she could ever dream of. This is every person's dream, is to go from rags to riches. And here she is. She's living the dream. And all of a sudden now her uncle comes and says, we're going to need you, now that you're in that position, to utilize that influence for good, because we are in desperate need. In fact, if something's not done, we're all going to be wiped out. And don't think you're going to be spared, because they're going to find out that you're a Jew too. So finally, after talking, she states this phrase that you addressed last week, and she finally musters up courage and she says, well, I'm going to go and do it. I'm going to go talk to the king. And there was a rule that if you went to approach the king and you weren't invited, that you could be put to death. So she risked her life to go and speak to the king, to try to change his mind about this decision that was made, this edict that went out. And she said this very bold phrase. She says, well, I think I know what I got to do, and if I perish, I perish. Essentially what she's saying is, I think I know what's right, and if it doesn't really necessarily work out for me, then so be it. I just need to be obedient and faithful to what I need to do, and let the chips fall where they may, and let the consequences come. So this is where we leave off in chapter 4, and then now we get into chapter 5. The conversation continues, and we see that she's starting a little bit to kind of put this plan together, and part of her plan is they decide, and this was mentioned in chapter 4, to pray and to fast for 3 whole days, day and night, to seek God, to seek the face of God, and to pray and to fast. So we get this moment here, this role reversal, but all of a sudden she demonstrates this huge sense of courage. She was courageous in the face of danger. She takes this huge threat. And in fact, the one thing that comes to my mind is that it wasn't that she wasn't afraid. Oftentimes we think in order to be courageous and in order to be bold, that means we have to be fearless. I think that's bogus. In fact, the one thing that comes to my mind is that it wasn't that she wasn't afraid. Oftentimes we think in order to be courageous and in order to be bold, that means we have to be fearless. I think that's bogus. In fact, the one thing that comes to my mind is that it wasn't that she wasn't afraid. Oftentimes we think in order to be courageous and in order to be bold, that means we have to be fearless. Personally, honestly, how many of us in here deal with fear? If you're honest with me, you say, there's fears that I have. Some are big, some are small, but I deal with these fears, right? And the thing about it is we don't have to think that we need to live into this kind of idealistic expectation that we can just like somehow never experience fear. In fact, what I would say is if you don't experience some kind of fear, there's something wrong with you. For real. So courage isn't necessarily like the absence of fear. It's having the resolve to be able to keep going even in spite of fear. Even in spite of fear, I'm not going to let the fear hold me back from doing what needs to be done. You see, I think her love for her people was bigger than her fear for her life. This is something that's huge that shows us tremendous leadership in the life of Esther. So the thing that I really just appreciate about this passage is that they don't escape the fear, they don't run around the fear, but they name the fear. Mordecai names the fear. The fear is this: if something's not done, we're all going to die. That's not a good thing. So let's name that fear. And after they name the fear, okay, they begin to pray boldly against that decision. How many of us in here, when we're faced with a fear, with a challenge, with a doubt, right, will boldly write it out and say, well, this is what it is, and I'm going to pray right now that God would deliver me from that. I don't want to live under that threat. I don't want to live under that daily fear. I don't want to live under those conditions. I'm simply going to say, I believe my God is bigger than this thing that I'm afraid of. I believe that my God's power is able to deliver me and us from the kinds of things that we can easily be governed by. So they name this fear. And I want to encourage you with that. I want to just pause for a moment and simply say this. If there is something right now that you're either able to recognize, or maybe it's subconsciously kind of driving you into this place, I want to encourage you to simply wrestle with that. Maybe you need to take some space to identify what those things are, so that they're not just in the background eating away at our soul, but we can identify what those things are. And I want to encourage you to go to somebody that you can count on. And you got plenty of people here on this campus, and simply ask them, hey, I want you to do me a favor. Can you pray for me in this area? Can you pray for me in this area? I need some support. I need some covering in this moment. I want to encourage you to do that. Don't do it on your own. Name it. Name that fear, and then simply bring it before God and bring people in with you. So the other thing they do is, in addition to naming it, in addition to praying, they call a fast. And it's a fast that is like a community fast. It's Esther commits to doing it, Mordecai does, and they spread the word. So Esther gets all of the folks within the royal household that are serving her to fast with her. And Mordecai does the same on the outside in Azusa. And they begin to fast. And many of us in here are like, well, what do you mean fast? Like, is it the opposite of slow? Fasting, okay? This is something that maybe some of us in here practice. Maybe it's something that some of you are like, I have no idea what you're talking about right now, okay? Fasting. So what is fasting? Why fast? Why should we consider a fast? You know, the season of Lent is coming up, which is an important season for us in the Christian tradition, where we contemplate our mortality. We contemplate what it looks like for us to simply prepare ourselves, right, for the resurrection of Christ. So it's this practice that we do before we celebrate Easter, where we simply come to this place and we seek God in purity. So I want to share a couple of reasons why fasting is significant. Okay, so maybe you've practiced, maybe you've done this before, maybe you haven't, but I want to encourage you to consider it, and let me give you a little bit of just some thoughts about what fasting is. First of all, fasting is a discipline. It's a discipline. Man, discipline is tough. Discipline is hard for us. Essentially, it's to voluntarily make yourself uncomfortable. To be reminded that our reliance on God daily is more real than the basic natural instinct of hunger pangs. If we keep this pattern up, if we're fasting and we continue to fast, then literally our body's telling us, you're going to die. The second thing that fasting does is it gets us to a place where we can purify. And in some ways, it's almost like based on, if you do any research, have anybody seen What the Health, right? You thought I was going to cuss in chapel, didn't you? Gotcha. Okay, so What the Health. I started looking at it, and then I turned it off because I got really guilty, and I like meat. But anyway, But seriously though, like when we think about all the things that we eat, all the things that we put in our body, okay, if we think just a little bit more about all the chemicals that are involved, the processing and all these different things, then a fast literally is purifying us physically, because it's allowing us to kind of release and get rid of all the things that are part of our American diet. But it's more important than just physical, it's spiritual as well. It purifies us because it reminds us that there are more important things than even just feeding our own body. Another thing that fasting does is it breaks us of selfishness. You might be like, what are you talking about? It's a practical application. Our body's saying, this is what I need, this is what I need. And we're simply saying, yeah, but there's stuff that you need more than what your grumbling stomach is telling you. And what that is reliance upon God. Seeking God. So they call a fast and they begin to seek God. When we're faced with dire circumstances, really, it seems like there's three kinds of options that we can choose. And I love that Esther chooses the best one. The first one is sometimes we're tempted in cases to take matters into our own hands. We're kind of like, well, I'm not going to sit around waiting for God to do something. So there's an issue, there's a problem, I'm going to go solve it. Another one is we have people that are on the other end of the spectrum and they're like, well, I'm facing a big issue. I don't have what it takes to solve it on my own. So I'm just going to sit back and wait and like, God, go do your thing. But there's a third way that's like truly trusting in God and being prepared to take action. That's the story of Esther. Esther trusts in God. She has faith in God. She fasts. She seeks the Lord, but she's also ready to go and do something. So we see her going and taking action, and she takes this huge risk. She goes, she seeks out the king, and she knows that even coming into his presence is putting her at danger in and of itself. But the king in that moment, while they were praying and fasting for God to do something, all of a sudden the king gives her this gesture of extending his scepter in her direction, which was essentially saying, you are welcome into my presence. That very gesture was evidence that there was a miracle that just took place. See, her life could have been taken from her, which would have completely destroyed anything that they might have been able to do, but instead God miraculously works on their behalf. It's a sign of favor. So we still haven't seen the solution yet. There's still a threat against the Jewish people, but simply that gesture was a sign of God's favor. And I want to simply say to you right now that when you're in the midst of seeing challenges and threats that are surrounding you, be on the lookout for signs of God's favor in your life. Be on the lookout for these reminders that God is with you, even in the middle of that storm that you're going through. Be on the lookout for those things so that it encourages us to know that God is at work. So the king says to her after she comes in, and he says, what is it that you come to talk with me about? Even before you bring that request to me, let me just tell you that up to half the kingdom is yours. So whatever it is that you want, just let me know, and we'll work it out. So the king just gives her this generous offer, and we all know what she wants to talk with the king about. We all know what she wants to ask the king to do. But imagine being given this opportunity. It's almost like a blank check that's being written. Okay, what would you do with a blank check? Some of you are like, oh, I'm a good Christian. I just write $100 on it. Yeah, right. Be like, well, first of all, I'm going to pay off my loans. Okay? Secondly, I'm going to get rid of this junky car that I have. All right? So she's given this blank check by the king, whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. And she could have selfishly turned that into a personal gain. She could have turned it into something that allowed her to elevate herself. But instead, she recognizes that when given that opportunity, there was one reason why she went. And she doesn't respond selfishly, but she responds on behalf of her people. So I simply want to ask us to consider this. You see, they prayed, they fasted, God intervened, okay, and God did this miracle. It really was a miracle. The miracle was this, if you didn't catch it in that little video, that right in the middle of these threats, the king just randomly so happened to ask to be read the history of what had been taking place in the kingdom. And what was read to him was the story of how Mordecai had recently saved his life. But he was never acknowledged or recognized. So just in that moment when they were asking God, God, do something. We don't know what you're going to do, but we need you to show up and we need you to do something. And all of a sudden now Mordecai is remembered. Mordecai is remembered by the king, and that turns the story completely around. So God intervened in a beautiful way. And the reason why I think that's so significant is because I think sometimes we in our Christian faith have so relied upon things that make sense to us that we have ruled out the possibility of God working in miraculous ways. We've so relied upon cause and effect, causation, that, oh no, here's why it happened. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe here's the reason as to why something happened. When in reality, we have to be open to the fact that God can do what God's going to do whenever God wants to do it. We need to be open and reminded of that. Okay, so in this story, we see this. We see God working in a supernatural way, kind of challenging some of our epistemology that there's only certain ways that things can get done. But in reality, God is bigger than simply our ability to make sense of stuff. So what is it that you are facing right now? Are you being driven by discouragement, or is there an opportunity, a space for you to truly believe that maybe God can show up? Maybe God can show up in that. So I want to finish with this. I'm looking through this story from chapter 1 all the way till it ends, and I'm looking around and I'm noticing that there are some details in this story that just do not seem very like PG-13. I don't know if you ever read this story before, but there's stories of impalements and massacres and a little bit of manipulation and all kinds of these themes that arise in this story. And I honestly don't really know what to do with it. I don't want to make too many theological statements about what I see there. But one thing that I would say is this: trusting in God and following Him isn't as clean and perfect as we make it out to be sometimes. In fact, here's one thing that bothers me. Sometimes I think people think being Christian equals being nice. Let's just be nice. That's kind of the way to go. I believe sometimes that as those of us who follow Christ, like in the case of Esther, in the case of Mordecai, they were angered by evil. They were angered by things that were not of God, things that were going against their people. They were righteously and justifiably upset and frustrated. I have a hard time sometimes. I have conversations with people, and I'm frustrated about something, and they're like, oh, come on, brother. Let's not get too excited about this topic and issue. And what I would say is, no, you need to get excited about it. In fact, you not being upset about what's going on out here is an indication that you're not following the God of justice. Rather than feeling like we always have to walk around just being sensitive and nice and careful, when in reality, God might be calling us to do some hard work every once in a while. Esther wasn't in a pretty clean story, in other words. She was in the middle of some difficult things. I want to simply ask us, what might God be calling us to as we look around and see the issues that surround us today? I wonder when one of these days, God willing, we meet our Creator. I wonder if God's going to say, well done, my good and faithful servant, or you should have done a little bit more to help out those who couldn't help themselves because instead you stood on the sidelines just thinking about your own life, trying to be nice to people when in reality I needed you to get upset about the things that are destroying people's lives. See, every once in a while we have to think about the way in which our faith is not always clean. But Jesus dives into that. Think about what Jesus did. Jesus, the Son of God, at the right hand of the Father, left heaven to come down and to join us in this crazy earth and world that we call that's full of brokenness. In fact, he made himself dirty and jumped in there with us so that he could pull us out and bring us to where he is. When we think about our responses, when we think about Esther, when we think about what's going on here, we need to be reminded that it takes a faith, it takes risk, it takes a trust in God that we might not have on our own. So I'm going to ask if the worship team can come on up as we get ready to conclude here tonight. Just as we started earlier, right before I came up, and I simply said, maybe you're carrying something. Maybe there's a fear. Maybe there's a situation or challenge that seems bigger than what you're able to handle. Maybe there's something that is so far beyond what you think you could even control. I want to ask you right now, as a symbol of surrender, to just stand up. And we're going to just sing a chorus or two of this song as we get ready to conclude here tonight. After we sing a few songs, I'll come up and close in a word of prayer. And for those that need to leave, you're more than welcome after that point to head out. And for those who want to stick around and continue to seek God, maybe you need to keep pressing in and saying, Lord, I need to welcome you into these spaces. I need you to work in me and the things that I'm carrying. If that's you, you could stick around a little bit later. But go ahead and just put your hands out just like this. This is a symbol of surrender. Maybe you're carrying something. It's kind of a way of presenting something. I don't know what that is that necessarily you are wrestling with, right? Maybe it's an insecurity. Maybe it's a doubt. Maybe it's a fear. Maybe it's a situation. Maybe you got one of those text messages that I was talking about, or one of those phone calls that just kind of creates a little bit of a devastating moment. So Lord, right now we come before you and we present to you these things, recognizing that just like Esther, we often carry things that are bigger than what we can handle, and we need you, Lord. We need you. We can't do it on our own. So, Father, I pray right now for each person that, regardless of what they're carrying, that you would give them a sense of peace. You would fill them with a sense of hope. You would bring renewal in this place, that we might look to you, that we might trust in you. God, would you meet us right where we are? In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to get that for you.